I generally start by cleaning the shutter case first, wiping it inside and out to remove any traces of grease and dust and dirt, any grit that might have found its way in. You can tell by the state of this cotton bud that actually the shutter is quite clean. It's not unusual for that to be quite black and dirty by the time I'd wiped out something as much as that. And here I'm just using Naphtha cigarette lighter fluid to clean this, and that's a pretty good solvent to use for this sort of thing. It will lift off most grease. Perhaps not particularly energetic when you strike very dried out waxy stuff, but for most purposes it's good. So I was just looking at the thread here where the retainer ring runs on the back of that to hold the shutter into the camera. It's a bit stained looking. That may be surface corrosion most likely, and that may well be why the retainer ring was a bit awkward to get off, a little bit stiff, even though it wasn't physically tightened. It didn't roll off easily. Oh, that case is good. Here we have the retainer plate. I usually do these tasks in a sequence out of habit as much as anything else. It's useful to have some sort of sequence so that you ensure that all parts get dealt with and things don't get forgotten. And also, if you've got a sequence you've used before, it's probably a sequence which means that it actually works. You don't want to be assembling things and then have to take them apart again to put some other component in that should have gone in first. This plate's quite stained looking. I don't know whether you can see that well on the camera. It's very light surface corrosion, I would say. It's similar, it's much the same on the other side. Quite commonly when you see that on a plate like that, it means that it may be stains left over from old oils that have settled on there, and the oils themselves may have been cleaned away, but they may have left their traces behind or some surface corrosion. It's very faint. You can tell if it's a problem typically when you wipe your cotton bud over those surfaces. If there's a serious problem, if the surface is rough and likely to cause a problem, you can usually tell that. You feel it as you wipe your cotton bud over it. This all looks good. This side is the shutter blade side, and this is the important side in terms of friction, because the shutter blades have to be able to swing freely, otherwise you won't get good speeds. That looks okay. This is the moving plate for the adjusting the diaphragm. Often this part is greasy. It's the rearmost piece of the shutter, and has, particularly with cameras that have a helical focusing mount and move the whole shutter and lens assembly, the oils probably from the helical focusing mount will find their way in, and typically that's from the rear of the shutter, so the diaphragm often gets quite greasy. That looks okay. See a few fingerprints on here, nothing dramatic at all, that's quite good. And the blades all need to be cleaned. Blades are relatively delicate. You have to be cautious with cleaning them. You do not want to bend a blade. If you bend a blade, it is very difficult, or can be very difficult, to assemble the diaphragm. So it's usually quite important that you're very gentle with these cleaning the blades. For the same reason, I don't normally polish the blades. Shutter blades, if they have some slight surface corrosion or roughness to them, or even serious marks on the finish, you can polish them with Brasso, and that's a fairly good and safe practice. But diaphragm blades have rivets on them that form the pivots, and those rivets can catch on a cleaning cloth or a polishing cloth very easily, and you can rapidly move from having 10 good diaphragm blades to having 9 good diaphragm blades and one that's got a fold in the middle. And if you get any serious sort of fold in one of these blades, you're not going to get it out. It's very thin. It's probably a spring steel, and once it's bent, you're not going to get it straight in a hurry. You can work at it, but it's much better if you don't have to. So diaphragm blades, be careful with them. You don't want to catch a cleaning cloth or the cotton bud on one of those rivets and damage the blade. There are a few marks on these blades. I can see one there. That's not coming off. That will stay there. I'm not taking any heroic measures to try and polish off marks of that nature. They are not creating a problem. You can't see these blades as well as I can, I would imagine, but I'm sort of looking at the surface of the blades, and they do have a faint hint of surface corrosion or oxidation, I suppose. But given that they are diaphragm blades and not shutter blades, that's okay. Typically you blame any corrosion on anything ferrous, on ingress of moisture. Now you may notice I'm being particular about putting the blades down in a certain order. That's because the blades are not symmetrical, they are not the same at both ends. One end of the blade, the rivet will be closer to the corner than the other one, and that's important when you reassemble the shutter. They all have to go in the same way, otherwise you will end up with a less than round aperture. And if you put them all in the wrong way, assuming that it will assemble and work, and it may well do, you would end up with apertures that are not what you expect it to be. They'd either be slightly larger or slightly smaller. These blades are quite clean. I don't think there'll be any difference in the way it works once I put it back together than before I opened it up. That's not always the case, of course. Alright, so I've got my blades all clean. I've got my mechanism plate and the case clean. Next I need to assemble the blades onto the retainer plate. And I have a jig for doing this on the smaller shutters. I don't have one to use for here, so I'm just going to have to jury rig something. Well, going with the automotive theme, I've just put another socket on the top there, which is just the right diameter for the centre of this. Now, assembling this, the plain side goes up, the side with the 5 small dimples on goes down. Next, assembling the blades. These blades are a decent size, so they shouldn't be hard to assemble. So the end with the hole closest to the middle of the blade, furthest from the edge, goes down and into the hole in the mechanism plate. You can see the advantage in laying the blades out so they're all in the same direction, so that you can pick them up and place them easily. Diaphragm blades are interleaved. They're not just stacked one on top of the other like shutter blades. So there's a definite first blade with shutter blades. With diaphragm blades, each blade rests on top of the next blade at one end and under the next blade at the other. So what that means is at this stage where the holes are covered by blades I've already put in, I have to pull the blades back out carefully to expose those holes, and fit the next blade in the sequence. Of course, there's plenty of opportunity to slip and displace something, and then you are back to square one, installing blade number 1 again. So it's certainly a task that you get better at with practice, but the main thing is you need to have a lot of patience. That's the last blade in position. Now I have to lift these blades back over the top of that last blade without displacing anything. And swing them back into the centre against this jig. Next we've got the moving plate. And it would have been very clever if I'd made note of where exactly this sat. So I'll work that out now. Three, and so there's 2 holes there and there. I'm looking at the mounting holes in the shutter plate and on the plate here. So I'm looking at the alignment of things. Somewhere about there, I believe. Right, let's try it there. That's just on those holes now. I'm just checking to see if I've got that in the right position. That looks very promising. If that moves that way. No, I haven't got that in the right position. I had that in exactly the wrong position. Right, that plate goes on there, and make sure these rivet pins are all sitting correctly in those slots, which is largely a case of making sure that everything's centered, that none of them are trapped underneath. That one there is trapped underneath. I'm checking all of those. They all appear to be in place correctly. And now I can lower my case over the top. Settle it in place. I can lift that piece off that jig now, I don't need that. Or its mate. Yeah. Just checking from this side. Everything looks right. Got my 3 screw holes where the screws hold this to the mechanism plate, the retainer plate to the case, and I can put those in. Got to be gentle because I've got nothing holding that plate down. And of course if I disturb it and the blades move and the pivots come out of their respective holes, I'll be starting again. I can do without that. I'm doing those screws up I'm not doing them up tight, I'm just doing them up until they reach the end of their travel. Let's see how we got on. There we go, the diaphragm opens and closes correctly, that's good. So I can do those 3 screws up. And there's not much movement in them, so they must have been almost all the way. The blades move quite freely, that's good. And a bit of fluff there, get rid of that. And the lever can go back on. So I need to line up the hole in the back here with the hole in the mechanism plate so we can pass the screw through, and it goes, it's right there. Just having a look at that lever, it looks quite clean. Going to give that a wipe. And it's almost without feature, so you could put it on the wrong way up, but the pointer is pointing to the front where it points against the aperture scale presumably. So it sits on this way round, so the pointer comes up to the aperture scale here. I have to align those holes up through the hole in the retainer plate, through the hole in the moving plate, and to the setting lever. That's one. That's the second one. Let's check that lever, see if it moves smoothly. It actually feels a little bit rough. That can only be the surface between the setting lever and the shutter. The case, I'm going to undo those screws, take that lever off, put a tiny smear of molybdenum paste on the back of that. It should have some resistance, but it should feel smooth. It doesn't feel smooth. First I'll look at the surface of this, see if there's any roughness. There's nothing to note. Just rub a bit of molybdenum paste on here. And molybdenum paste, you need very little of it to do a job. Usually it's just a dirty mark is all you've left on it when you've finished. It seems fine. And we know that was round on the scale here. Line those holes up. See if I can get that screw back through. One. Two. Let's do those up. Check the action of the lever. Yeah, that's much better. It's certainly not loose, but it's smooth in action. That's just what I wanted. That's good. And it was just the feel of the action that bothered me. It wouldn't have affected its function at all. It was simply the feel of it. It felt rough. It wouldn't have made any difference in use. But we like things to be good, not nearly good. So, next, the mechanism plate. Looking at the state of the mechanism plate, there's a little bit of dirt and rubbish here, nothing dramatic, just as you'd expect with an old shutter that probably hasn't been serviced in a few years. Bit of dust has got in. Some of that would be the dust will have stuck to a film of lubricant. May not even been lubricant on that point originally, but it may be where lubricant has settled, volatiles from lubricants have settled. So normally I just start by cleaning the mechanism plate with naphtha on a cotton bud. Just want to lift off dust and dirt. Be careful of springs. This spring here is important. Be careful not to damage that spring. And with the retard gear train, when you're cleaning around past the retard gear train, normally I would hold back the pallets with my thumb at this end, swing the lever across and release the pallets. That keeps this arm in. It also keeps this spring wound up and away from the edge of the case, because you could damage that spring if you're poking and prodding around there with a cotton bud cleaning it. And you see as I release the pallets that the arm swings back across, and you can see the spring just peeking out here. You certainly don't want to damage that. If it was damaged it might still work, but you would have odd things going on. You would probably find that either the speeds were erratic, something of that nature, or the shutter might not run down completely on some occasions. I'm wiping the inside of the lens tube, make sure that's clean. And at the rear of the mechanism plate, where the blade actuating ring runs in here, that looks quite clean. That's that sort of level of staining is probably just from the aluminium as much as anything else. It's all very clean. That's good. So I'm quite happy with the cleanliness of the mechanism plate. What I want to do is flush the retard gear train and the delay action with a bit of naphtha, just to make sure that they are nice and clean. So normally I would just sprinkle some naphtha on there, hold back the pallets, work that action backwards and forwards. Usually this is sufficient, unless there were some heavy deposits of dried grease or something on there. This would be sufficient to flush off any dust or light oil that had settled on the mechanism. Certainly the tone of that has changed as I've flushed it. It's the sound it makes as it works has changed. That's good. I'm just going to blow the solvent out of there. Don't just leave the solvent in there to evaporate, because if it's dissolved any oils and they're floating in solution in the solvent, if you just leave it to evaporate, the solvent will evaporate and you'll be left with the oil again afterwards. Battery going flat here, I'm going to change that.